Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Social Studies Online from the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. My name is Abby Pfisterer. I'm an education specialist at the National Museum of American History, and we're so thrilled to have you join us today. Today, our topic is universal human rights, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation my colleagues will have here shortly. Before I hand it over to them, though, to introduce themselves and get started, I wanted to set out a couple of expectations and just tips on how to use today's episode. So whether you're watching this live or in a recorded version later on, we welcome you to follow along. I'll post the link to the Learning Lab collection you see on the screen. I'll post that link shortly. And if you're watching live, we encourage you to join the conversation. You can use the chat box however you're watching, either through YouTube or through Facebook. And you can ask questions of our presenters today. You can share comments as well. If you have any questions about what content can or can't be posted, there is a link to the Smithsonian Terms of Use in the comments section or in the description of today's episode. So we're encouraging you, like I said, to join in. And like I said, I'm excited for an engaging conversation today. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Orlando Serrano.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us. And we are going to be talking about universal human rights today. And like Abby, I'm excited to talk about this. Before we do jump into a group of cultural resources that our guest has brought to share with us and to talk about, let's introduce ourselves. My name is Orlando Serrano, and I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History. And we are grateful to be joined by Meredith Holmgren today. Meredith, can you please let us know a little bit about the work that you do at the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage? And maybe for folks who aren't familiar with this institution that's part of the Smithsonian, say a little bit about what you all do over at Cultural Life and how it fits into the rest of the Smithsonian units.
Sure. My name is Meredith Holmgren. I'm curator of American women's music. I'm part of the American Women's History Initiative, which is a pan-institutional initiative to uplift the role of women's history in our National Museum. My focus is on music, and the unit I'm based at, which is the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, we specialize, music is one of our specializations. So we host the Smithsonian's record, nonprofit record label. We produce a folk life festival on the National Mall every year that celebrates the living culture and traditions of people around the world. And then we also have a very large archive of folk and traditional arts related materials. And I'm happy to share some of that material with you all today.
Very cool, very cool. And, just out of curiosity, mine and maybe the folks who are joining us, how did you end up at Center for Folk and Cultural Heritage? What were you doing before this that brought you towards Smithsonian and the work that you do now?
Sure. So as a university student, I studied ethnomusicology, which is sort of a blending of music and anthropology. So I always loved music, but I knew I was more interested in the social and cultural aspects of music than music theory or composing per se. So that led me to ethnomusicology. I worked in a number of nonprofits after that. One protected free speech for musicians and composers internationally. I did a number of, research, internships, short temporary jobs related to, human rights, free expression, cultural heritage, cultural policy, these kinds of things before going to grad school where I studied anthropology and Asian studies. And then I was hired out of grad school at the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C.
All right. Sometimes folks are curious about the roads that lead folks to their current jobs, and folks, ethnomusicology, if you're interested in music, but maybe you're a little bit off key, another way for you to go. And I know that's what I would do because I cannot sing. All right. Thank you, Meredith, for that introduction. And we're going to turn now to our actual collection and, learn a little bit about human rights through the artifacts that you've brought to share with us today. And for folks who are joining us and maybe don't know, today is actually Universal Human Rights Day, December 10th. And we're going to start off here with an artifact that has Eleanor Roosevelt on the cover. And can you tell us about this? Why did you select this, Meredith?
Sure. So just a little background about human rights. The world had gone through its, two world wars early in the 20th century, World War I and World War II, where tens of millions of people were killed. And emerging from that collective trauma, a lot of nations and citizenry wanted to set out to establish a shared set of principles and values across the world, which nations should strive toward. And that's sort of the background of where the idea of human rights came from. Eleanor Roosevelt, she was the first lady of the United States from 1933 to 45. And she was a very powerful, influential, visionary diplomat as well, both during her tenure as First Lady and afterwards. She was really pivotal to, getting the United Nations together as an international body and cultivating this shared sense of values and principles that we call human rights. Many of the rights set out in the Universal Declaration, which was the first statement on human rights, that many of those were based on the United States Bill of Rights. So there was an American component, American influence that came in here. The Universal Declaration had, this shared set of principles. Like I said, some of those may be familiar to us. Everyone being born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everyone has the right to liberty, life, security. Everyone has the right to be free from slavery or servitude. No torture, cruel or unusual punishment. You have a freedom to have nationality. You shall not be denied a nationality. You have the right to free movement within the borders. So those are some examples of the principles that were in the Universal Declaration. It is really important to note, however, that the Universal Declaration is not a legally binding document. It is the foundational document for human rights law, but it was more of a, like I said, a shared set of principles that countries were, encouraged to sign on to. And after they did that, then there were two main legal covenants that came out, and those were legally binding. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later on. But this particular album, Eleanor Roosevelt is being interviewed about her role in creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what that process was like, negotiating with other countries and really striving for this document.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mary, for that, the background, the information on sort of how the historical context for the development of the Declaration for Human Rights coming out of the atrocities of two world wars. That makes a lot of sense. And for letting us know a little bit about the role that Eleanor Roosevelt played and the influence that the U.S. Bill of Rights had on the document and the shaping of it. I do want to point out a couple of elements of Learning Lab for the folks who are joining us, because Learning Lab is where we house all of our materials for social studies online. And if you are interested in looking at these later on at your own time and pace, we do provide the links for it later on. So folks, if you do decide to explore this collection, anytime you see a paperclip with a number next to it, that means there's more information on there. And in this particular case, this is the link to the actual recording. Is that correct, Meredith?
Yes, so the recording is fully available commercially as an album. You can download it, you can stream it online, and hear firsthand from Eleanor Roosevelt, her firsthand experience with cultivating human rights across the world.
Great. And then some other navigational tips for you all out there. Whenever you see more than one image down here in the bottom left-hand corner, you press these up and down arrows to see the different images. Sometimes it's the front of an artifact and the back. Sometimes it's a close-up of a particular detail. And then you can, of course, zoom in and out to see what's going on here. All right. Well, we've got a little bit of the foundation for how this idea came about, some of the influences on the Declaration for Human Rights. Let's move on to our next document. So these are the actual articles. Is that accurate?
Yes, this is so for people to be able to exercise their human rights within the human rights framework, they need to be informed of what human rights are and what specifically that entails. So this was a poster created by Amnesty International. It's housed at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum of the Smithsonian's in New York, and it's a very strong image with contrasting colors, but it's also an informational object. So you can see as we zoom in that the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are spelled out in brief throughout the poster. So it is an informational document that's meant to cultivate an understanding, an education about what human rights are.
Okay, and folks, there are 30, and Meredith pointed out some of them earlier on, some of the other ones right here, right? The right to desirable work and to join trade unions, which will be a part of our conversation later on, right to education. Some of these rights that perhaps sometimes we take for granted, but some folks do not have access to. So the signing on, though not necessarily like Meredith pointed out, a legally binding contract, there are other legal ramifications that we're going to talk about. But it's a statement that folks make to try and abide by these. And one more piece of information on navigating our learning lab. Anytime you click on the I, you can get all the information on where to find this. As Meredith pointed out, this is actually housed at the Cooper Hewitt, another one of the Smithsonian institutions. We've got some descriptions, and you can also find it on your own if you'd like to use it in another context or in another setting. All right, let's move on to our next artifact here. All right, what can you share about this particular image?
Sure. So a little background now, we're getting into, the two legally binding covenants. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the covenant that covers civil and political rights. And some examples of the rights laid out in that covenant are, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of redress. Everyone has the right to a free and fair trial. The right to life. No one should be arbitrarily deprived of their life. No slavery, no servitude, no forced labor, these kinds of things. And there are a lot of parallels to civil rights struggles in the United States. So racial minorities, particularly African Americans, have not always had the right to vote. And the right to vote and participate freely in the political system is one of the civil and political rights laid out in international human rights covenants. So this particular image is from a civil rights protest called the Selma to Montgomery March. That took place in 1965. It was organized by Dr. Martin Luther King to protest the way that African Americans were denied equal access to voting in the state of Alabama in particular. Here we have, artists who have joined that cause. We have Joan Baez up front on the right. We have Leon Bibb in the middle, and we have Harry Belafonte on the left there. And they are singing as a part of this protest movement in favor of civil rights for African Americans.
Now I'm gonna ask you to draw on your training, I guess, here a little bit. Do you happen to know what some of the songs were that were sung at this particular march?
Sure. It's, for example, like We Shall Overcome was very popular during the civil rights movement, a way of motivating people to stay strong and stay the course. Music was used a lot to produce a sense of solidarity among people. You're not alone. We're in this together. We're going to prevail together. And music did play a very important role in, cultivating and informing people about their civil rights and really motivating them to take action.
Okay, thank you. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about Joan Baez here, but can you give us a little bit of background on who she is and her role, using music at different demonstrations and protests as we transition to our next artifact?
Sure. So Joan Baez is known as a very socially conscious folk artist from the United States. She played a very strong role in the civil rights movement, as we just discussed, but she also was very interested in international issues and international human rights. And that's where we get this poster here, where she's actually one of the lead musicians, the headliner, in a protest concert to raise awareness about human rights violations in the country of Chile in South America. For those who may not know, in 1973, there was a coup d'etat in Chile that overthrew a democratically elected government. And there were a lot of human rights violations that took place during that process. People were killed. People no longer had the right to free speech. Their votes were not processed equally. And so this drew the attention of people across the world and, decrying the state of human rights in Chile. And artists were really front and center in that movement. A lot of artists within Chile were, imprisoned or killed. And so it was really important for artists around the world to show solidarity and raise awareness to this issue.
Yeah, and sort of to add on and build off of what Meredith is letting us know in the context, providing for what was going on in Chile during this time and why the title of this is a benefit for the restoration of human rights in Chile. The date also matters. So I know that in the United States, September 11th matters for particular reasons. In Chile, September 11th is important because that is the day in which the events that Meredith has described unfolded in the country. So 9/11 has reverberated up and down the Americas in different ways. And for folks who are interested in that, that's another great line of inquiry that you can take on, and a wonderful way to think about the ways in which some of the artifacts that we house here, yes, they're US based, but as Meredith has pointed out, they are transnational in scope. They reach across boundaries, and these issues of human rights are universal and important for folks to talk about. We're going to get to a couple more objects, but I have a question here. Can you say a little bit more about the role of music historically and in our contemporary moment? So what are some through lines that you see with regard to music and how it is used? And are there other examples for folks who maybe are interested in protest music as a way to think through universal rights? What are some other recommendations of folk artists who you're familiar with? And maybe for our younger friends who are watching, more contemporary artists who see themselves sort of carrying the mantle or carrying the torch of the work of these folks?
Sure. So as I mentioned, music has historically played a really important role in movements of protest and struggle, produces a sense of solidarity, of collective worth and strength, collective strength. It also plays a role in informing and disseminating information. It can tell stories about, things that are happening, political issues. It can name particular people, who are figures in the struggle. So there are all these educational, social, cultural components really wrapped up in music of protest and struggle. The Smithsonian has a really strong collection of this type of music. Smithsonian Folkways Recordings, our nonprofit record label, this is one of their areas of specialty. So we have recordings that include Joan Baez, that include Pete Seeger, who's another guest artist in this particular concert. We have artists like Woody Guthrie, Suni Paz, a lot of artists documented on the Smithsonian's recordings that have spoken to human rights in their work. Bernice Johnson Reagan, a really important civil rights singer who actually worked for the Smithsonian for a while. We have a lot of her work as well as one of her archival collections. So the Smithsonian has a really rich treasure trove of artists related to human rights, as well as civil and political protest music. So I encourage you all to check out Smithsonian Folkways Recordings. dig through that archive. There are a lot of free articles, multimedia articles, and free streams online, so you can, browse without shopping, because they do also sell some of this music, but it's primarily an educational website, so you can learn a lot by going to the page and learning more. I will also say it is a living record label, so it's not only archival material, but we do record new artists, artists like Lula Wiles, Our Native Daughters, contemporary younger groups that are still speaking to issues of social struggle and human rights. So I encourage everyone to check those out.
Thank you. And Abby has put that link in the chat for folks who are curious to hear some of this music and to learn more. We encourage you to do that. And we have about 10 minutes left together, and I do want to encourage you and remind you that if you have any questions for Meredith or for us, please feel free to ask as we move on to our next artifact. So here we have a poster from American history, and it reads, "Restore Human Rights for America's Workers." And we've got another image here on the back. Can you say a little bit about this particular artifact, the context, Meredith? And I'm kind of curious about the notion of restoring human rights, because that seems to me that something has been lost.
Good point. So we talked a little about the Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. There is a second covenant, and that is for the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And those are framed more around, economic security, labor issues, groups in society, and their rights. So, for example, Article 11 recognizes the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for themselves and their family. And that includes food, clothing, housing, and the continuous improvement of living conditions. That also includes the right to be free from hunger, to improve methods of farming and food distribution. Then we have Article 13, which recognizes everyone's right to education. The education shall enable people to participate freely in society, and work towards maintaining international peace. So that's sort of guarding against a type of education that might brew conflict, particularly against racial, ethnic, and religious groups that's specified in the covenant. And then the last article I'll pull out is everyone has the right to take part in cultural life. So that means they have the right to, enjoy science and culture. And so this is a really unique document. I will say the U.S. has signed on to the legally binding Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. It has not signed on to the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which include education, being free from hunger, labor rights, all of these things. So in that context, when we're looking at these posters, Restore Human Rights for American Workers, it's really speaking to the fact that the U.S. is not bound to the same, economic labor rights as many of our international peers. And there is a degradation sometimes of those rights, and a lack of accountability within the human rights framework.
Thank you. That's very interesting to learn, and especially given as you were talking, I couldn't help but think of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his famous speech on the four freedoms, right? That we should be free from want, free from fear, and that those seem to overlap a lot with these particular articles that are bound up with this, legally binding document or treaty, or however you want to think about it, that we aren't signed on to. That, out of curiosity, what are some of our peer countries who are signed on?
So many of our, allies in Western Europe, for example, they take this right to education, the right to freedom of hunger very seriously in the way that they implement public policy. Everyone has a right to go to school, And in fact, they've taken it further in that, you're required to go for a while, just like the US, but you will also offer higher education for free or for a very accessible low fee for people. I can give a very specific example.
Yeah.
I did my graduate work in the Netherlands. So I graduated from a Netherlands university, my 2 master's degrees, and I was a legal resident of the Netherlands during that time, and I was actually paid money to go to school for my master's degrees, which is a stark contrast to the United States. If I had gone to graduate school here, I might have had to take out loans. There's minimal government support for pursuing education at those higher levels.
Yeah, I can attest from personal experience that is very different than the grad school experience in the United States. But again, Meredith, I appreciate you pointing out the very material impacts, on a day-to-day living basis of policy, right? When policy is shaped in one way or another, it does impact the folks' day-to-day lives of the country in which that policy is being laid out or not. To get paid to go to grad school. I might still be there right now, Meredith. I'm not gonna lie. I like learning. So.
Yeah. And grad school is one thing, but there are other very fundamental material needs like the right to food and housing that a lot of our allies take very seriously. Amsterdam, I'll give another Netherlands example, about a third of their housing stock is public housing. And you have a right to get on the list for that public housing. It often takes a very long time for your, queue to come up because people hang on to those spots. Yeah. But they've invested quite heavily in making sure that people have a right to housing. It's the same with food. There are very few people who have, standard mental capacities who are starving there because they distribute their food in a very systematic way, making sure that people are free from hunger.
All right. Well, folks, we have one more cultural resource left. And for this last one, we're going to go through something called the thinking routine. It's out of Project Zero based in Harvard. And it's a way for folks, to process information, whether it's visual text, linguistic text, a way to get your thinking going and to make that thinking visible. So we have a few questions that we're going to think through today on this particular pin. And the title is Human Rights for Farmers. It's a protest pin. And the routine we're going to do is called Step In, Step Out, and Step Back. And so I'm going to ask Meredith a few questions and ask her to respond. Now, we've used our time together here to get a basic understanding of what the Declaration of Universal Human Rights is, some ways that countries are attaching themselves to it in a more binding manner and implementing policy that secures those rights for the folks who live within that country's borders. So we had some working knowledge. And so I'm going to ask here, Meredith, we're gonna think about the farmers, all right? We're gonna think about the farmers. And the first question I have is, given what you know at this time about everything that we've learned and some of your other background knowledge, what do you think a farmer, who is wearing this pin may believe, know, or have experienced?
So this pin was from a very particular political movement, as you can see, from 1979, where there was legislation on the table to change the way in which food was distributed, regulated the value of the food, and it was, I believe, rendering a lot of the products of farming to be less than the cost of production. So farmers were saying that, hey, if human rights include an equal distribution of food, if this is a fundamental principle, and we also have a right to fair compensation for our labor, then we feel like our human rights are being violated at a number of levels. So this pin is from that movement. They actually had a tractorcade where they drove tractors into Washington, D.C. to protest this particular farm bill.
Okay, so we are learning that the farmers are experiencing some unequal distribution of access to food. Prices are lower. We're going to step out a little bit here. And what else would you like to know, given, that that context, what else would be helpful to learn about farmers, policy, agricultural policy more specifically? What are some other questions that raises for you?
I think it raises the role of the government in subsidizing farming in the United States. That's been a very strong political issue for a very long time here. We have a lot of agricultural production. Does the government subsidize farming equipment? Does it subsidize land, prices for distribution, anything like that to increase our production and food security across the United States? So I guess the questions it brings up is, what is the role of government in regulating food and agricultural processes?
Okay. And if we step back just a little bit, in thinking through, some of the experiences these farmers may have had at this time, some of the questions that raises for you about the role of the government, when we're learning about somebody else's experiences and perspective, what do we need to do to better understand that?
I think we need to be really good listeners. So listening to a diversity of voices, to people who have different experiences with a particular topic. So hearing about the government's perspective on what their role might be one thing, listening to the farmers themselves and their experiences is another, and then listening to consumers and people who eat food. Do they feel that the system is meeting their needs, and what do we need to do to address everyone's stake?
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Meredith, for being with us. Thank you for folks who joined us live. Again, don't be shy. Ask us any questions next time. But we are running to the end of our time together today. I'm going to turn it over to Abby to give us some information about where to find resources and what will be coming up next.
Thank you, Meredith and Orlando, for such a wonderful discussion. And to do this on the anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration, it's really meaningful. I know particularly this year, as so many people face hunger, face challenge as a result of several pandemics, this is such an important conversation. So thank you. I hope you all who are watching found connections, saw new ways to think about this topic, and I hope it raised some questions for you too that you can continue exploring. So on the screen, you see the link to get to the Learning Lab. It's also in the chat or the comment section. So please, we encourage you to check this out. We'll add a link to this video there as well later on. And I hope you'll join us again next time. So we are taking a little time off for the end of the year, but we'll be back on January 21st. Our topic will be the presidency, and we'll be talking about this in conjunction with inauguration. So hope to see you then. Bring your questions and have a wonderful and restful end of your year. Stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you again next time.